Hi, it's Crissy here. Welcome to my Copic marker coloring tutorial. I'm going to explain how I get smooth gradients in large areas, use the tip-to-tip shading technique, fix areas of ink pooling, use color in white areas, erase over-the-line mistakes, and treat highlights. Let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my zero blender. I want to saturate the area that I'm about to color so that it's nice and wet, and so that when I do color, it's not going to leave as many lines of demarcation as if I were to do it dry. I don't want to get close to the lines because if I do, it's going to pull the color across the line and into an area where I don't want it. So try to leave about maybe 1/8 of an inch away from the line of the next portion of the image. The first color that I'm using is E15. I'm moving the brush tip in tiny little circles, circular motion, going back and forth over the whole area, and I'm trying to be as fast as possible so that I'm using it where it's wet. And you can see that when it's a very large area, it's better to have the area wet first because it'll also help keep those lines of demarcation from forming, and that's why I do it in the first place. I don't need to do it on the really small areas. I'm going to start shading now, and the first color I'm using for shading is E37. I want to shade around the outside edges of this cookie man because I feel that's where a cookie gets browned, of course. And of course underneath anything that would have dimensions such as the candy or the icing. Now right after I put E37 down, I pick up my E15 again and I color over the areas that I put E37, and I use these flicking motions to blend it out. And just to let you know, there's a sweet little surprise waiting for you at the end of this video if you watch the whole thing. You can use this flicking motion to blend an area out. Sometimes it works, other times not so great. I didn't like the result I got, so later I went over it with my circle technique. I prefer to complete one area at a time when I'm shading because that way the ink is still wet and you can get an easier blend if you go in right away with your blending colors. So now I'm back with the E15 to blend it all out. Now I'm going to put a shadow underneath this little row of icing that I'm not going to blend out on purpose. Back to E37 for that. The reason I'm leaving it is because it's going to pop out more towards the viewer if it's a sharp-edged shadow. It's going to make it look like it's 3D. I'm using E15 to make a nice smooth gradient here on the top of his head. Now what's really cool about these alcohol markers is that you can actually borrow color from one marker and transfer it onto another one temporarily. So I'm going to swipe the tip of E15 onto the tip of E47 to get some of that darker ink, and I'm going to color with E15 until the tip becomes clean again. And that happens actually in just a few strokes. It doesn't take very long. And you don't have to worry, you're not going to contaminate the tip of your marker permanently. It actually releases the ink as you color. This happens to be a much easier way to blend out really dark shadows, and it also helps prevent the ink from pooling most of the time. You can still have problems with ink pooling if you do it a little too much in one area. And that actually happened to me, so you'll get to see how I made the mistake and then how I fixed it. But this is a really cool way to use the darker Copic markers, because what happens is sometimes with the really dark colors, there's so much pigment and not very much of the alcohol base. And so sometimes the paper gets oversaturated with that pigment and then it just sits on the top, making a really gucky, shiny mess that looks terrible and you can't work with it. But I do have a way of fixing that, at least if it isn't too bad of a pile of ink, it can be fixed. So I'll show you that a little later. Now, I didn't like how there were a lot of lines of demarcation left on the face here that I was coloring, so I went over the whole thing with E15 one more time. I'm going to go back in and darken a few of the shadows. Sometimes after they've dried, they've lightened up quite a bit, so you sometimes have to go back in. Just repeating this whole process now with all the other different areas of the gingerbread man. Wetting it first with 0, putting on a layer of E15 followed by shadows with E37, and blending some of them out with E15, but leaving the ones underneath the icing not so blended. I like them to pop out a bit more, and if the shadow's sharper, it is going to pop out a little more. Making them nice and dark with that E47 with the tip-to-tip technique. I'm going to repeat this whole process in each area individually because that way I'm working on a wet area and I'll get a nicer blend. Now, I don't know if you'll be able to see this very well on your computer screen, but on the hand I'm coloring right now, I left a very tiny edge where I didn't put the really dark color, so that when I color the leg underneath, I can make that really dark, and the hand will actually look like it's popping out towards you, the viewer, because of that one little tiny line that I left highlighted. You'll see it happening here after I've got this color laid down and I start to put in the shadow. Okay, now you can really see that highlighted area under his hand, on his hand, and how it really makes the hand appear as though it's popping out towards the viewer and that the leg is tucked back. I'm actually going to do the same thing on the right foot. You'll see after I've finished completing this area, when I get to the other foot, right where the toe is, I've also left a little line of highlight so that you can really see it pop forward towards the viewer. You'll see what I mean in a minute. There, see? Now I'm not coloring the shadow right up to the line, but I've left that little area highlighted so it really pops forward. I'm just going back in now where the ink has dried and lightened, so I'm going to just darken some of the areas up that I had. Oh, and you know what? I just made that mistake on the hand where I've got ink pooling. Eek! Now what am I going to do? Well, let's see. There's a way to fix it if it's not too bad. So as soon as you see that happening, stop. Then you can take your blender and with very light, gentle strokes, you can pick up some of that ink that's pooled on the surface. Don't push that zero blender into the area too hard. One stroke at a time, and then clean the tip off on a scrap piece of paper. And now I'm pushing any color that I've got over the lines, I'm pushing it back towards the line. Now I'm going to show you how I like to do my whites. I like to grab BV20 and start with that. It doesn't have to be a cool color, but I just happen to pick BV20 for this one. It can be any kind of grayed down color for white. And don't be afraid to put a fair amount on, because it's really going to give those white areas some dimension if they have some nice shadows on them. So anywhere you think those shadows might be falling, depending on where you've imagined your light source to be, just go ahead and lay them in there. I use a little bit of BV23 along with BV20, but not the same amount. So this is going to be much narrower, smaller amounts that I put on, just along the outer edges of these shadowed places. I like to blend out those two colors with B000. It just softens it up a little bit and causes a more smooth gradient from the shadowed areas into the pure white. For the red in the candy, I'm using R14 first, followed by R27 and R59, and then going back in with R14 to make sure they're all blended out. My first green layer is YG09. Now I've left a little space where I want a stark white highlight. I'll show you what I'm going to do with that later. We're not going to just leave it just like that, but that's the first step. I'm going to go back in with G19 and blend it out with YG09, just like we did on the other parts with E15 and E37. It's the same technique. Here I am again using the tip-to-tip ink transfer technique to pick up some really dark G29 and blending it out with YG09. Sometimes the tip of my YG09 wasn't getting clean fast enough for me to blend it out, and it was retaining too much of the G29. So what I would do is I'd scribble on a little scrap piece of paper right beside me just to clean the tip off so I could go back in and blend it all out with the YG09 with a cleaner tip. So that's when you see me scribbling over to the right. Now I like using the blender to bring some of that green into the white area because I want it to soften up a little bit. It's a little bit too stark for my liking. So by doing that, I'm wetting that area, and so the ink is being drawn into the white area that you've got the blender solution on. It's kind of hard to see with the camera, but you can see it in real life. I'm going to repeat this process up on the candy. And we're almost done. I'm going to add a few highlights on his cheeks, his hands, and his feet. So just a few strokes to remove some of the color, and then you'll have some cute little highlights. Make sure you keep watching. There's a little surprise for you at the end of this video. Any fans of Whimsy Stamps are going to love it. Thank you so much for watching, for joining me on this little coloring adventure today, and hopefully we've learned something together. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.